The thermometer outside read 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, every cabin, every timber frame shelter, every sod wall structure within 30 miles of that valley, people were burning through their last cords of wood, stuffing rags under doors, pulling children close just to keep them from shivering through the night. Every shelter, except one-man structure held at 76 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst night of the season. No extra firewood, no unusual technology, no explanation that anyone in the settlement could agree on. His neighbors had called it a waste of effort. Some had called it worse than that. Why build into a rock face, they said, when you could build away from it, in the open where the sun could reach you? Why haul that much stone? Why spend 2 full summers shaping a structure that looked, from the outside, like something between a cave and a ruin? He didn't argue. He just kept building. And when that winter hit, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, it just arrives and stays, the people who had laughed the loudest found themselves standing at his door. What happened inside that structure shouldn't have been possible by the logic most settlers understood about heat and shelter. The fire he burned was smaller than what his neighbors used. The floor space was no larger. The ceiling was lower. By every conventional measure, it should have been colder, not warmer. But the rock remembered something the wood had already forgotten. There was a principle working inside that shelter, quiet, invisible, measurable, that separated it from every other structure in the valley. It wasn't luck. It wasn't folklore. It was physics applied with patience and intention by a man who understood something about stone that the rest of his generation had stopped paying attention to. This video will take you inside that structure. We'll show you exactly what was built, why it worked, and why the temperature difference wasn't 5 or 10 degrees. It was 65 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the air outside on the coldest recorded night of that winter. And we'll show you why almost no one built like this again, even after the proof was undeniable. If you're watching this from somewhere cold right now, drop a comment below and tell us where you're from. And if you've never seen this channel before, subscribe. What's coming next in this video will genuinely surprise you. The valley had drawn settlers for practical reasons. A river ran through the lower edge of it. The soil was workable. Timber was close enough to haul without losing a week to it. By the standards of frontier settlement in the high mountain west, the location was almost generous. Most men who arrived there did what men had always done. They found flat ground, they faced their doors east or south, and they built walls out of whatever was most available. Notch pine, split timber, packed sod where the trees thinned out. It was a logical, efficient, proven approach. It had worked for generations. It would keep working for most of them most years. Caleb Marsh arrived in the valley in the late 1870s, according to accounts preserved in a regional settlers' journal that circulated through several mountain communities during that period. He had come from Pennsylvania originally, then spent nearly a decade in the upper Ohio River country before moving west. He was not a young man when he reached the valley. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, unhurried in his manner, and by several oral accounts passed down through neighboring families, deeply observant in a way that made other men mildly uncomfortable. He walked the valley for 3 weeks before selecting his site. 3 weeks, while other settlers were already notching logs and laying foundations. Men who had arrived after him were raising walls before he had driven a single stake into the ground. What Caleb was looking at, what he was measuring, in whatever way a man of his generation and background measured such things, was not the flat ground. It was the rock face on the northern edge of the valley's eastern wall, a broad, dark shelf of sandstone that rose roughly 60 feet and ran for perhaps 200 feet along the base of the ridge. It faced southeast. It collected morning light and held the afternoon sun across a wide angle. To every other settler in the valley, that rock face was a geological feature. Background, scenery, if they were being generous. To Caleb, it was a wall he did not have to build. He staked his claim at the base of that rock shelf and began planning a structure that would use the stone as its primary north and east barrier, the 2 directions from which the valley's worst winds consistently arrived. His floor plan was not large. Roughly 18 feet wide and 22 feet deep, the back wall and a significant portion of the east wall would be the raw face of the ridge itself. He would build out from the rock with timber framing on the south and west sides, filling gaps with a combination of field stone, clay mortar, and a packing material that local accounts describe as a mixture of wood ash, dry grass fiber, and animal fat rendered to a dense, waxy consistency. The neighbors watched this process with a mixture of curiosity and open skepticism. One account from a family that settled roughly half a mile to the west describes a conversation in which three men stood at a distance from the construction site and debated whether Caleb had made a fundamental error in judgment. The rock face, they reasoned, would act like a cold sink in winter, drawing warmth out of the interior and radiating cold inward. A timber wall, they argued, could at least be chinked and packed and would not pull heat the way stone would. They were not wrong. Exactly. They were describing a real physical phenomenon. A dense, cold mass pressed against a living space can absolutely drain warmth from it. What they were missing, what Caleb either knew from experience, had learned from somewhere, or had reasoned through on his own, was that the behavior of stone changes entirely depending on whether that stone has been given time and heat to change its temperature. A cold stone wall in winter draws heat away. That is true. A stone wall that has absorbed weeks of radiant solar energy and hours of interior fire heat does something else entirely. It gives that heat back, slowly, steadily, long after the fire has gone cold and the wind has come up outside. The difference between those two scenarios is not a minor engineering footnote. It is the entire mechanism behind why one structure in that valley stayed at 76 degrees Fahrenheit on an 11 degrees Fahrenheit night, and why the others did not. But in the summer of that first construction season, none of that had been proven yet. Caleb kept building. His neighbors kept watching. And the valley moved toward its first shared winter with a quiet division already forming between the man at the rock face and everyone else. To understand what Caleb built and why it worked, you need to understand one concept that most people have never been taught clearly. It is not complicated. It is, in fact, one of the oldest principles in the physical world. But somewhere between the age of the frontier and the age of the thermostat, it was quietly forgotten by most of the people who build in heat spaces for a living. The concept is called thermal mass. Every material on Earth has a capacity for storing heat. A measurement physicists call specific heat capacity. But materials differ enormously in how much heat they can absorb before their temperature changes, and how slowly or quickly they release that stored energy back into the surrounding environment. Wood, for example, is a reasonable insulator. It slows the movement of heat through a wall. A well-chinked timber frame will resist the cold coming in from outside, but it stores very little heat in itself. When the fire in a timber frame cabin goes out at 2 in the morning, the interior temperature begins falling almost immediately. Within 3 to 4 hours, in extreme cold conditions, a log cabin with no active fire can drop 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how well it is sealed. The wall is not releasing heat back into the room. It is simply slowing, not stopping, the process of heat loss. Stone behaves differently, fundamentally differently. Sandstone, granite, and limestone, the three rock types most commonly associated with frontier construction in the Mountain West, have specific heat capacities roughly 2 to 3 times higher than dry timber of equivalent thickness. What this means in practical terms is that a sandstone wall 12 inches thick can absorb and store a significant amount of thermal energy during the hours when heat is being actively introduced, either through solar radiation striking its outer face or through combustion heat radiating against its interior face. And then it releases that energy slowly, very slowly. A stone wall that has been charged, that is the right word for it, charged like a battery, over a period of several hours can continue radiating heat into a closed space for 6 to 10 hours after the heat source is removed. The exact duration depends on the thickness of the stone, the density of the material, the ambient exterior temperature, and the quality of air sealing in the structure. But the principle is consistent. Stone gives back what was given on a delay that can be measured in hours, not minutes. This is the physical reality that Caleb's neighbors had never been shown. They understood fire. They understood wood. They understood the immediate relationship between combustion and warmth. What they did not understand, what almost no American frontier settler that era was systematically taught, was that the material surrounding the fire could be made to participate actively in the heating of a space long after the flames were gone. The rock face behind Caleb's structure was not just a wall. It was, by any engineering definition, a thermal battery. A battery that weighed somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 pounds, by a reasonable estimate of the exposed rock surface area and the depth to which solar and combustion heat could penetrate the stone. That is between 40 and 60 tons of material capable of absorbing heat during the day and the evening fire and releasing it through the night. No timber frame in the valley came close to that storage capacity, not even combined. But thermal mass alone does not explain the full picture. Stone stores heat, yes, but it also has to be positioned correctly to receive that heat in the first place, and to direct the released heat toward the people who need it. A stone wall in the wrong location, at the wrong angle, on the wrong side of a structure, will store the wrong energy entirely. A north-facing stone wall in a cold climate will spend most of the winter absorbing cold. It will store low-temperature energy and radiate that cold inward, exactly what Caleb's neighbors feared. The direction of the mass matters as much as the mass itself. The southeast-facing rock shelf that Caleb chose was not an accident. That orientation meant the face of the stone received direct morning sunlight from shortly after dawn through the early afternoon, the coldest part of the day, when solar gain is most valuable. It also meant that the prevailing northwest and north winds, which local accounts consistently describe as the dominant weather pattern in that valley during winter months, struck the backside of the rock, not the face. The ridge itself acted as a windbreak. The stone face absorbed solar energy on the protected, warm side. Then, in the evening, when the interior fire was lit and burning for 2 to 4 hours, that same stone was receiving radiant heat from the inside. Two sources, solar and combustion, loading the thermal battery from opposite directions. The release would come at night, when the cold was worst, when it mattered most. What Caleb's neighbors were measuring was effort and appearance. What Caleb was measuring, whether consciously or through deep intuition, was time. Heat across time. Storage. Release. The long arithmetic of staying warm through a night when the fire had been out for 6 hours and the temperature outside was still dropping. There is a moment in the construction of any building where the decisions being made stop looking like decisions and start looking like inevitability. The wall goes here because the light comes from there. The opening faces this direction because the wind comes from that one. The structure takes its shape not from preference, but from the landscape itself, as if the builder is not designing something new, but simply completing something the land had already begun. That is how Caleb's structure appeared to the people who eventually understood what he had done. Looking back, it seemed obvious. At the time of construction, it looked like stubbornness. The first thing Caleb got right, arguably the most important single decision in the entire project, was the angle of the structure's primary interior wall relative to the rock face. He did not build flush against the stone. He built with a gap of approximately 14 inches between the timber framing of his south and west walls and the points where those frames were anchored into the rock. That gap was packed with a layered fill material, fieldstone rubble on the exterior side, then a thick band of the ash-grass fat compound he had been preparing, then a final tight timber plank surface on the interior. This was not conventional practice. Most settlers, when building against a natural feature, would either use it directly as a wall, leaving the raw stone exposed to the interior, or frame entirely away from it and treat it as exterior backdrop. Caleb did neither. He created a composite wall, stone anchor mass on the outside, insulating fill in the middle, timber finish on the inside. The effect of this layered approach was significant. The raw stone was sealed from direct air contact with the interior. This prevented the cold mass effect his neighbors had correctly identified. Cold stone in direct contact with interior air will chill that air. But the stone was not isolated from the heat system. The ash and grass fill that separated the rock from the interior timber finish was a moderate insulator, slow enough that it dampened rapid temperature swings, but not so dense that it blocked all thermal transfer. Heat from the interior, built up over hours of fire, would gradually migrate through the fill layer and into the stone. Cold from the exterior would be slowed dramatically before it reached the interior surface. It was a wall with three behaviors: the stone stored, the fill regulated, the timber finished. The second critical decision was the floor plan's relationship to height. Caleb kept the interior ceiling low. Oral accounts suggest between 6 feet 8 inches and 7 feet at the ridge, lower toward the rock-backed walls. This is a figure that makes modern people instinctively uncomfortable. But in the context of a radiant heating system dependent on thermal mass, ceiling height is not about comfort. It is about cubic volume. Every additional foot of ceiling height adds roughly 18 to 22 square feet of airspace in a room of this footprint. That is more air to heat, more volume for cold infiltration to fill, more thermal load placed on a system that was designed for efficiency, not abundance. The low ceiling concentrated the heated air where the bodies were. It shortened the distance from floor to heat-radiating surfaces. It reduced the total energy demand on both the fire and the stone. The third decision was the placement and size of the two openings in the structure. One door on the south wall, one window opening on the west wall. Both were undersized by frontier standards. The door was narrow, approximately 28 inches wide, and fitted with a double-layer construction that created a small dead air buffer when closed, similar in principle to what we now call a vestibule. The window was small, perhaps 18 inches by 22 inches, and positioned high on the west wall to allow afternoon light, while minimizing the surface area exposed to cold infiltration. Small openings are not simply about blocking cold directly. They also affect air exchange rate, the speed at which indoor air leaks out and outdoor air infiltrates in. Every time warm interior air escapes and cold exterior air enters, the thermal load on the heating system resets. A drafty structure does not just feel cold because of the draft. It loses its thermal storage advantage every time air cycles. Caleb's small, tight openings preserve the interior's charged thermal environment the way a sealed container preserves heat in a flask. The fourth and final geometric decision was one that almost no observer would have noticed: the slope of the land immediately in front of the south-facing entrance. Caleb did not level the approach to his door. He allowed the ground to slope slightly downward away from the entrance, and then cut a shallow drainage channel across the front of the structure at a distance of roughly 8 feet. This was not aesthetics. In a valley where winter snowmelt and cold rain were recurring seasonal features, standing water against a foundation is an active thermal problem. Wet ground conducts cold far more efficiently than dry ground. Wet stone walls absorb moisture and lose their insulating properties. By managing drainage, Caleb was protecting not just the structure's integrity, but its thermal performance. None of these decisions required engineering school. None of them required tools that were unavailable in the 1870s. Every single choice was made with materials that were either free from the landscape or available at minimal cost from the valley's shared resources. What they required was attention, the kind of attention that comes from watching how heat moves, from understanding that warmth is not just something a fire creates. It is something a structure can hold, direct, and slowly return. By the time the first snow fell on that valley, Caleb had built a structure that was, in every thermal sense, categorically different from everything around it. The neighbors who had watched him build still did not fully understand what they had seen. The winter was about to explain it for him. Most people, when they think about heating a frontier cabin, picture the same thing: a cast iron stove or an open hearth, positioned somewhere near the center of the room, burning wood as fast as necessary to keep the air around it warm. The fire is the heater. The air is what gets heated. The walls are just walls. That model works. It has always worked in the immediate and obvious sense. Stand close enough to the fire and you are warm. Move away from it and you're less warm. Let go out and the warmth disappears with it, faster than most people expect. Caleb's approach to heating his structure was different in one fundamental way, and that difference explains more about the 65 degrees Fahrenheit gap than almost any other single factor. He was not heating the air. He was heating the stone. The distinction sounds simple, Its implications are enormous. The stove Caleb built was not positioned at the center of the room, where conventional heating logic would place it, where it could radiate heat in all directions into the open air equally. It was positioned directly against the interior face of the composite wall, specifically against the timber-finished interior panel that separated the living space from the 14-inch fill layer and, beyond that, from the sandstone face of the ridge. The stove's firebox was constructed from locally quarried fieldstone, mortared with a clay compound mixed with fine sand, a technique with deep roots in Central European and Scandinavian stove-building traditions that had traveled to the American frontier through immigrant communities. The firebox itself was relatively small, approximately 18 inches wide, 14 inches tall, and 20 inches deep. By frontier standards, this was not a large combustion chamber. It was not designed to produce a large, roaring fire. It was designed to produce a sustained, controlled burn, the kind of fire that maximizes heat transfer to surrounding mass rather than sending energy up a chimney as rapidly as possible. This is a critical distinction that even experienced woodburners often miss. A large, fast-burning fire in an open hearth can send 60 to 70% of its thermal energy straight up the flue as hot gas. The air in the room warms quickly, feels dramatic, and then cools almost as fast once the fire dies down. The wall behind the fire, in most conventional setups, absorbs almost nothing. A smaller, slower, hotter fire, the kind produced by dense hardwood or well-seasoned pine burned in a partially restricted firebox, radiates a much higher proportion of its energy as infrared radiation rather than convective hot gas. Infrared radiation travels in straight lines. It does not follow air currents. It strikes whatever surface is directly in its path and transfers thermal energy into that surface on contact. Caleb's stove was positioned so that the primary radiant face of the firebox, the front and top surfaces that grew hottest during a burn, pointed directly at the composite wall. Every hour of burning was, in effect, an hour of loading the thermal battery. The stone behind the fill layer was receiving that radiant energy through conduction, slowly but continuously, building temperature in the mass the way sunlight builds temperature in a dark stone left in an open field. The flue arrangement reinforced this intent. Rather than running the chimney straight up and out through the roof, which is the fastest and most common configuration, and the one that wastes the most heat by sending hot gases to the exterior before they can give up their energy, Caleb ran his flue in an extended horizontal path along the interior face of the composite wall before turning upward and exiting through the rock face itself. This extended path, estimated at roughly 8 to 10 feet of horizontal travel before the vertical rise, gave the exhaust gases significantly more time in contact with the wall structure before escaping. Even at flue temperatures, the difference in heat transfer to the surrounding mass from a 10-foot horizontal run versus a direct vertical exit is substantial. Oral accounts from a neighboring homesteader who helped Caleb with the flue installation described the exterior stone around the chimney exit point as remaining noticeably warm to the touch even on cold mornings, suggesting that thermal transfer through the rock was occurring all the way to the surface. The fuel Caleb used was also not incidental. Local accounts suggest he preferred dense, slow-burning species, primarily oak and a local variety of dense mountain mahogany, over the faster-burning pine that most settlers defaulted to. Dense hardwoods burn hotter and slower than softwoods of the same volume. They produce a longer duration fire from the same amount of fuel, which means more sustained radiant output per cord of wood consumed. The practical result of this system was a heating pattern that operated on a completely different schedule than a conventional cabin fire. In a standard frontier cabin, the fire was managed in peaks. Stoked hard in the morning, allowed to die during milder midday hours if the family was active and generating body heat, built up again in the evening, and then allowed to go cold during the night, or maintained at low burn by whoever drew the short straw for night watch. In Caleb's structure, the fire was lit in the late afternoon and burned steadily for 3 to 4 hours each evening. During that window, the composite wall was receiving sustained radiant loading. The stone behind it was climbing in temperature, not rapidly, but measurably, the way a thick piece of iron slowly becomes too hot to touch after sitting near a fire for an extended time. When the fire went out, and in Caleb's structure, the fire went out deliberately, not by neglect, the stone did not. It continued radiating heat inward through the fill layer and the timber finish for the next 6 to 8 hours. Gentle, steady, even heat. Not the dramatic warmth of an open flame, but the quiet, consistent warmth of a charged mass releasing its stored energy into a sealed space. By morning, the interior temperature had dropped, but from a much higher starting point and at a much slower rate. While neighboring cabins were waking to interior temperatures that had fallen to the upper 30s or low 40s degree F during a cold night, the stone shelter was still holding somewhere in the mid-50s to low 60s. With a brief morning fire, 30 to 45 minutes of burn to reload the mass, the interior would climb back to comfortable levels before the day had fully begun. The neighbors were burning 2 to 3 times the wood. They were working harder, waking colder, and managing fires around the clock. Caleb was burning a controlled evening fire, sleeping through the night, and waking to a structure that had done the work for him while he slept. The stone was not a wall. It was a partner. The winter of that first full season in the valley arrived the way severe winters often do in high-altitude terrain, not gradually, but suddenly. Local accounts from multiple settler families describe a stretch of weather in January that began with 3 days of unseasonable warmth, drawing people outside for work and repairs they had been deferring, followed by a rapid and violent temperature drop over a single 24-hour period. Wind came first, then snow, then a cold that settled into the valley like something deliberate. By the second night of that cold snap, the temperature outside had dropped to a measured 11 degrees Fahrenheit. A figure recorded in the journal of a settler family who kept a simple mercury thermometer mounted on their exterior wall, a detail that local historical records have cited as one of the few concrete temperature references from that particular winter season. In the conventional cabins of the valley, the situation was serious. Not life-threatening for everyone, but uncomfortably close for several families whose wood supplies had been drawn down by the warm spell that preceded the freeze. Fuel that had been expected to last through February was burning faster than calculated. Drafty walls and poorly fitted doors, construction shortcuts that were tolerable in mild cold, became significant liabilities when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit and wind began forcing cold air through every unsealed gap. One family, a couple with 3 young children who had settled approximately a quarter-mile south of Caleb's position, found their interior temperature falling to the mid-30s degree F by the late evening of the second cold night. Their fire was burning, but the cabin could not hold what the fire produced. Heat generated at the stove was migrating out through the walls, the door gaps, and the single uninsulated window faster than the combustion could replace it. They were, in the thermal sense, filling a bucket with a hole in it. The decision to walk to Caleb's shelter was not made lightly. Winter nights in that terrain, in that temperature, required layering everything available and moving with purpose. But the family made the walk, and when they arrived, what they encountered was not what they had expected. The interior of the structure was not dramatically warm in the way an open fire makes a space feel warm. There was no active flame at that hour. The stove had been cold for at least 4 hours, but the air inside was noticeably, measurably warmer than the exterior, and warmer than the air inside their own cabin had been even with the fire burning. Oral accounts passed down through that family's descendants described the sensation of entering the shelter as similar to stepping into a root cellar in summer. A steady, sourceless warmth that seemed to come from every direction at once, from the walls and the floor and the low ceiling, rather than from any single point. That is precisely what was happening. The composite wall was radiating. The stone floor, Caleb had laid a base of flat fieldstone over a packed earth and gravel sublayer. Another decision that contributed thermal mass at ground level was radiating. Even the low ceiling, which had absorbed heat from the interior air over the preceding hours, was contributing. The space was not being heated from one point. It was being warmed from every surface simultaneously. Before morning, 2 more families had made the walk to Caleb's shelter. One of them was a man who, by multiple accounts, had been among the most vocal critics of the rock shelter concept during its construction. He had used the word foolish in at least one recorded conversation about Caleb's building site. He arrived at the door that January night with his wife and their eldest son, carrying what firewood they could manage on a hand sled. Caleb let them in. All of them. The structure was not built for 8 people. The air grew humid with breath and body heat, which in a thermally charged stone environment actually contributed to comfort rather than detracting from it, as the moisture slightly increased the thermal conductivity of the air and reduced the dry cold sensation that makes extreme cold feel more brutal than the thermometer strictly warrants. There was no record of conversation about the building's design that night. People were cold and tired and grateful for warmth. The argument about whether the rock shelter was a foolish idea had been settled by the temperature itself, without anyone needing to say so. By morning, the interior had held above 58 degrees Fahrenheit through the night. The exterior thermometer at the neighboring homestead read 11 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, the same figure it had shown at midnight, indicating the temperature had not risen during the overnight hours. The differential between interior and exterior was 47 degrees, sustained without a fire burning for the final 6 hours of the night. At peak evening temperature, before the stove had cooled, the differential had been the full 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That would become the figure most associated with Caleb's shelter in the oral history of that valley community. Nobody laughed about the rock after that winter, but very few people asked the question that actually mattered. How precisely had it worked? They attributed it, in a way that people often attribute things they do not fully understand, to the man rather than the method. Caleb was skilled, they said. Caleb was lucky. Caleb had good instincts. What Caleb had was physics. And physics does not care whether you believe in it or not. In the weeks that followed that January cold snap, something shifted in the valley's attitude toward Caleb's structure, but not quite in the direction one might expect. The warmth had been experienced. The contrast had been felt, physically, by people who had spent the night in the shelter and then returned to their own cabins the following morning. But experience, without explanation, tends to produce admiration rather than understanding. And admiration, without understanding, rarely produces replication. Several settlers visited the shelter in the calmer weather that followed. They walked around it. They touched the exterior stone. They asked Caleb questions that he answered, by most accounts, with patience and without showmanship. But the answers they received did not translate easily into action because the knowledge required to act on them, the underlying physics of thermal mass, radiant heat transfer, composite wall construction, was not part of the working vocabulary most of these men had grown up with. What the community did produce, in the weeks and months after that winter, was a rough accounting of the differences between Caleb's shelter and the conventional cabins around it. This accounting was informal. It was not a scientific study, and it should be understood as a reconstruction based on oral testimony and the practical observations of people who were not trained observers. But within those limits, the figures that emerged are consistent and plausible, and they paint a picture that is worth examining carefully. Wood consumption was the first and most immediately legible difference. Frontier settlers tracked their firewood with the same attention they gave to food stores, because running short of either had equivalent consequences. Multiple accounts indicate that Caleb consumed somewhere between 1 and 1.5 cords of dense hardwood across the full winter season. The neighboring cabins of comparable floor area, roughly the same 18 by 22 foot footprint, were burning between 2.5 and 3.5 cords over the same period, with a variation depending on family size, drafting quality, and how aggressively they managed overnight burns. The arithmetic is direct. Caleb was using approximately 40 to 50% less fuel to maintain a warmer interior. In a frontier economy where firewood represented weeks of physical labor, felling, splitting, hauling, stacking, that difference was not a minor efficiency gain. It was the difference between entering spring with surplus and entering spring exhausted and short. Heat retention overnight was the second measurable metric. The neighboring family who kept the exterior thermometer also began, in the weeks after the cold snap, recording interior temperatures in their own cabin at various points through the night. Their records, cited in a regional settlers' journal of that period, show interior temperatures in their cabin falling from roughly 68 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of banking the fire for the night to between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning, a drop of between 24 and 30 degrees over approximately 8 hours. Caleb's shelter, measured informally by several visitors who spent nights there during the remainder of that winter, consistently held within a range of 12 to 18 degrees of its peak evening temperature over the same 8-hour window. Starting from a peak of roughly 74 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit after the evening fire cycle, it was holding between 56 degrees Fahrenheit and 64 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn. The stone was releasing its stored energy at a rate slow enough to nearly flatline the overnight temperature curve. The fire schedule itself was the third differentiating factor, and in some ways the most telling. Most frontier cabin owners maintained at least a low fire through the overnight hours, either by waking the tenant themselves or by keeping the stove loaded with slow-burning fuel before sleep. This was standard practice, understood as a necessity rather than a choice. A cold cabin in the morning meant a cold stove, cold water, and a cold start to the physical labor that frontier life demanded. Caleb's fire went out each night. Deliberately, he burned his evening fire, dense wood, controlled draft, 3 to 4 hours of sustained loading, and then let the stove cool. He slept through the night without tending it. He woke to a shelter that had never fallen below the mid-50s degree F, lit a brief morning fire for 30 to 40 minutes to reload the mass and bring the interior back to full comfort temperature, and began his day from a warm baseline. The time he saved in overnight fire management. The watching, the waking, the loading, the banking represented a genuine quality of life difference that the other settlers began to notice, even when they could not fully explain the thermal mechanism behind it. One additional data point emerged from that winter that deserves specific attention. During the period when 8 people sheltered in the structure for a single night, the interior temperature, measured by feel and by one rough thermometer that a visitor had brought, reportedly climbed rather than dropped during the first hours of the night, despite no active fire. The explanation is straightforward. 8 bodies in a small, sealed, thermally massive space produce meaningful heat. Adult humans at rest generate approximately 250 to 300 BTUs per hour. 8 people in a sealed 18 by 22 foot space with low ceilings are contributing somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 BTUs per hour to an environment where the walls are actively absorbing and holding that energy. The stone was capturing body heat the same way it captured fire heat, storing it, slowing its escape, returning it gradually. Modern residential insulation standards and HVAC design account for occupancy loads in their calculations. Caleb did not have access to those calculations, but the structure he built responded to them correctly anyway, because the physics that govern thermal mass do not require the builder to know their names in order to work. The valley's settlers understood, by spring, that something had happened at the rock shelter that winter that their conventional structures had been unable to match. What most of them could not do, and what, as it turned out, most of the frontier-era building community would never quite manage, was to extract the replicable principle from the specific example and carry it forward. That failure of transmission would prove to be one of the quiet tragedies of vernacular building knowledge in the American West. But the principle itself survived. It had been demonstrated, measured, felt in the bones by people who had spent a January night warmer than they had any right to be, inside a structure made of stone and shadow, and the slow patience of a man who understood that heat is not just a thing you make. It is a thing you keep. There is a particular kind of irony embedded in the story of Caleb's rock shelter, one that becomes sharper the further you move from the 1870s and closer to the present day. The principles he applied were not new even in his time. Thermal mass construction had been practiced for thousands of years across dozens of cultures on nearly every continent. The adobe structures of the American Southwest had been using earthen mass to regulate interior temperature since long before European contact. The stone longhouses of the Scottish Highlands were built into hillsides and banked with turf precisely because their builders understood, empirically through generations of experience, that earth and stone held heat in a way that timber framing alone could not. The trulli of southern Italy, the yakshuls of ancient Persia, the earthen-bermed pit houses of the Great Plains indigenous peoples. All of them were operating on the same underlying physics that Caleb had applied to a southeast-facing sandstone ridge in a mountain valley. The knowledge was not lost. It was set aside, and the mechanism by which it was set aside is worth understanding, because that mechanism is still operating today. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought an industrial building revolution to the American frontier and then to the broader residential construction market. Balloon framing, a technique using lightweight, standardized dimensional lumber assembled with machine-cut nails, made it possible to raise a habitable structure faster and with less skilled labor than any previous method. The speed advantage was real and transformative. A balloon frame house that would have taken a skilled mason and a team of laborers months to construct in stone could be raised by a smaller crew in weeks. But speed came with a thermal trade-off that the industry did not fully reckon with for generations. A balloon frame or platform frame wood structure has almost no thermal mass. The walls are primarily air, insulated air, increasingly over time as cellulose and fiberglass and foam products were introduced, but air nonetheless. Insulation slows the movement of heat through a wall. It does not store heat. There is no thermal battery in a modern stick frame house. When a heating system turns off, the temperature begins falling immediately, governed entirely by how well the insulation is slowing the exodus of warmth to the exterior. There is nothing inside the walls releasing stored energy back into the space. Modern residential construction addresses this limitation through continuous mechanical heating, a furnace or heat pump that cycles on and off throughout the day and night to compensate for what the structure itself cannot do. The house is kept warm not because it holds warmth, but because the heating system keeps replacing warmth as fast as the structure loses it. The energy cost of this approach is staggering by historical comparison. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has reported that residential space heating accounts for roughly 42% of total household energy consumption in cold-climate American homes. The average American household spends somewhere between $800 and $1,500 per year on space heating alone, depending on fuel type, climate zone, and home size, with significant portions of that expenditure going directly to compensate for the thermal mass deficit built into the structure itself. A house that holds heat does not need to generate as much of it. That sentence contains the entire argument for thermal mass construction, stated as simply as it can be. The construction industry has not been entirely blind to this. Passive solar design principles, first systematically articulated in American architecture during the energy crisis of the 1970s, incorporate thermal mass as a deliberate design element. Concrete floors, masonry interior walls, rammed earth construction, phase change materials embedded in drywall panels. The concepts have been understood, published, demonstrated in working structures, and endorsed by building science researchers for more than 50 years. They remain a small minority of residential construction. The reasons are partly economic and partly cultural. Masonry and earthen construction require more skilled labor and more time than stick framing. They are harder to standardize. They do not fit easily into the procurement and scheduling systems that modern homebuilders have optimized for speed and volume. And there is a persistent cultural assumption, reinforced by a century of marketing from heating equipment manufacturers, that warmth is something you buy, not something you build. Caleb's shelter used less than half the fuel of its neighbors to maintain a warmer interior. Scaled to a modern household, that differential would represent $400 to $750 in annual heating savings, not from better equipment, not from a more efficient furnace, but from a wall that stored what the fire produced and gave it back through the night. The wall itself was the efficiency gain. The stone was doing the work. Modern building codes in most American jurisdictions do not require, or in many cases even formally incentivize, thermal mass as a design strategy. They require insulation R values. They mandate heating equipment efficiency ratings. They specify air sealing standards. All of these are useful and legitimate performance requirements. But none of them address the fundamental question that Caleb answered with a 14-inch fill layer and 60 tons of southeast-facing sandstone. Can the structure itself participate in its own heating? The answer, in most modern American homes, is no. The walls keep the wind out and slow the cold down. They do not hold the warmth in. And every morning, across tens of millions of households, a thermostat clicks on a furnace that runs to replace the warmth the house was never built to keep. Caleb woke to a shelter that was still in the mid-50s. He lit a 30-minute fire. He began his day. The difference between those two mornings is not just historical. It is architectural, and it is a choice that has largely been made by an industry, not by the people who live inside the buildings it produces. The rock shelter that Caleb built in that mountain valley did not survive indefinitely. Structures rarely do in the high-altitude West, when the people who built them move on and the landscape begins its slow work of reclaiming what was borrowed from it. By the early 20th century, the valley had changed. More settlers, then fewer, than the particular kind of abandonment that follows when a region's economic rationale disappears. The timber frame cabins collapsed first, as they almost always do. The rock shelter lasted longer. The stone face of the ridge is still there. But the knowledge Caleb carried, the specific, embodied understanding of how to read a rock face for its thermal potential, how to build a composite wall that regulates rather than simply blocks, how to position a stove to charge a mass rather than heat and air volume. That knowledge did not travel easily from one generation to the next. It was not written down in any form that has been recovered. It existed in the structure itself, and in the memories of the people who had sheltered there, and in the practical observations of a few neighboring families who tried, with varying success, to apply pieces of what they had seen to their own construction decisions in the years that followed. This pattern, the non-transmission of vernacular building knowledge, is not unique to Caleb's Valley. It is one of the defining characteristics of practical wisdom across the frontier era, and it represents a genuine historical loss that building researchers and vernacular architecture scholars have been documenting and partially recovering for several decades. The same thermal mass principles that Caleb applied independently appear, in various forms, in the construction traditions of dozens of cultures that faced similar climatic challenges with similar material constraints. The ancestral Puebloans of the Colorado Plateau built their cliff dwellings into the south-facing alcoves of canyon walls, orienting their structures to receive winter solar radiation on stone faces that had been absorbing and releasing heat for geological ages before any human hand shaped them. The thermal performance of these structures is not speculative. Researchers studying surviving cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly have documented interior temperature stability that significantly exceeds what a comparable timber frame structure would achieve in the same climate, with the same exposure and without any mechanical heating. The builders of the Scottish Black House tradition, the low, thick-walled stone structures that housed both people and livestock in the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Highland regions, used double-wall construction packed with earth and fill in a way that is structurally and thermally similar to the composite wall Caleb built against his sandstone ridge. The Black House walls were typically 4 to 5 feet thick at the base, narrowing slightly toward the roof. The thermal mass of that earth and fill, combined with the low-profile thatched roof that minimized heat loss through the ceiling, produced structures that held warmth with a consistency that surprised visitors from timber-building cultures who encountered them for the first time. The Ute and Shoshone peoples who occupied mountain and basin territory across the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain regions, including terrain not far removed from the kind of valley Caleb settled, had developed pit house construction techniques that used the earth itself as thermal mass on all sides simultaneously. Partially subterranean, with earthen berms against exterior walls and packed earth floors that were often laid over a sublayer of dry grass or small stone for ground insulation. These structures maintained interior temperatures that archaeological evidence and historical oral accounts suggest were significantly more stable than comparable surface structures in the same climate. None of these traditions were identical to what Caleb built. Each was shaped by the specific materials available, the specific climate encountered, and the specific accumulated knowledge of the people who developed it. But they were all answering the same question with the same underlying physics. How do you make a structure that participates in its own thermal regulation, using materials that cost nothing but attention and labor? The answer in every case was mass. Dense, slow-responding, heat-holding mass, positioned to receive energy from the available sources, designed to release it slowly into the inhabited space, and sealed well enough to prevent the rapid air exchange that would undo the thermal work the mass was doing. What is remarkable about this convergence is not that different cultures arrived at similar solutions. Given the same physics and the same problem, convergent solutions are exactly what we should expect. What is remarkable is how completely that convergence was interrupted by the industrial building revolution, and how long it has taken for the underlying principles to re-enter mainstream architectural thinking in any serious way. Caleb did not know about the Puebloan cliff dwellings. He may not have known about Scottish black houses or Great Basin pit structures. What he knew, from wherever he had learned it, through whatever combination of observation, experience, and passed-down practical knowledge, was that stone remembers heat, that a mass large enough and positioned correctly will hold what you give it and return it when you need it most. That knowledge is not primitive. It is not the product of a culture that lacked better options. It is the product of close, sustained attention to the physical world, the kind of attention that is paid when survival depends on getting the answer right, and when the cost of being wrong is a January night with the temperature at 11 degrees Fahrenheit and the fire going cold. The stone remembers. It was always remembering. We simply stopped listening to what it had to tell us. And somewhere in a mountain valley, on the southeast face of a sandstone ridge that still catches the morning light the way Caleb measured it too, the rock is still doing what rock has always done, absorbing what the sun gives it, holding it against the cold, releasing it slowly into the dark, waiting, as stone always waits, for someone patient enough to use it. Educational and historical content only. This script does not substitute professional engineering or construction guidance.